Friends, this is a clock prophecy update for March 24, 2019. Before I get started with today's message, I'd like to comment on the conclusion of the Mueller report, in which no further indictments have been issued for any American, and during which no indictment was actually made against any American for involvement with Russia in an attempt to affect U.S. elections. What's most important about this, of course, is that there is absolutely no incriminating evidence against President Trump that has been produced by this investigation or probe. And every bit of positive news for President Trump is a push forward into the events of Revelation chapter 13. This is another example of the amazing interplay of and counterbalance, really, between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, as this escalation has brought social tensions to such a degree. I think it will be used by the forces of Antichrist to produce a false narrative, yet another false narrative, once we reach the near-fatal head wound event to the first beast. And on the clock, of course, the first beast is identified as Barack Obama. And I would ask that you read chapter 6 of my book, The Clock of the Four Night Watches, to understand the time measurements in Revelation chapter 13 that give us that identification, and also identify the hour of birth of the future King of England, who has been Americanized to the American public over these last several years, and who has met with President Obama in the Oval Office, and has met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and has even been asked to carry a message to the Palestinians that would give them reason to believe that the British monarchy and government is in favor of a Palestinian state and the dividing of Jerusalem. Now, the watch window that we entered on the 12th of January continues through April the 7th and represents the most critical period of watch on the clock thus far. The black ring portion of the clock comes to an end on July the 12th, 2019, and this may extend our period of watch into summer. While I can't say what isn't possible, I look for the Obama head wound event found in Revelation 13, verse 3, to be followed by a large meteor impact off the coast of Italy. These events will mean we have reached critical mass on the clock, at which point all the judgments of the seventh seal will begin to unfold. This will also mean the start of the four-part harvest, including the early rapture of the man-child, followed by the rapture of the church. It may seem I have focused less on rapture timing in these messages than on other issues, but the four-part harvest described by Jesus in his vineyard parable is a critical teaching of this ministry. My article on that topic links his words in Matthew 20 to all other passages on rapture timing in order to avoid the private interpretations we see circulating throughout the modern church. We are warned about this in 2 Peter 1:20. The four crops of Israel listed in Revelation 6, verse 6 are directly linked to the vineyard parable in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus did not use numbers or numeric groupings casually. His mention of four groups sent into the fields of harvest at specific intervals on the clock has a literal meaning. The crops referred to in John's Revelation represent four harvest groups and seasons, because there are four distinct groups of believers to be harvested. Some in the churches today see themselves as part of the 144,000. However, the underlying Greek used by John in his description of the man-child in Revelation chapters 7 and 12 makes clear reference to virgin males from each of the 12 tribes. This is impossible to confuse with Paul's characterization of the church as being female, or as a bride prepared for her bridegroom. Paul's prophecy in Romans 11 for future ethnic Jews and their redemption before the return of Christ points to this future remnant that John calls the first fruits of harvest in Revelation chapter 14. So it was future to Paul, and it was future to John. The redemption of the church cannot precede that of the Hebrew man-child in Revelation chapter 12. An earlier group of resurrected saints, those who were raised up after Jesus' resurrection but before he ascended, foreshadows the greater resurrection to come. While this smaller group does appear in the Lord's parable, it is not given a time of day by Jesus because only the 4 later harvest groups are relevant to those in our final generation. Notice the 4 times stated by Jesus in the parable. The 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour. This is a tie-in to the 4 crops listed by John in Revelation chapter 6, verse 6. We see the barley, the wheat, the wine or grapes, and the oil or olives, each harvested in its own season: spring, summer, fall, and winter. The first fruits harvest of a Hebrew remnant was foreshadowed by the translation of Enoch, whose catching up is represented by the harvest of barley in the spring. The later rapture of Elijah foreshadows the catching up of the church and is represented by the harvest of wheat in the summer. It was the separation of Elijah from Elisha when the senior prophet was caught up in his presence that foreshadows the separation of virgins at the door into the marriage, portrayed as a group of waiting virgins in the Lord's best-known allegorical teaching in Matthew 25. This is why Jesus also said, "And be ye yourselves like unto men that wait for their Lord, when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, you may open unto him immediately." The Lord in this passage echoes his warning of a separation to come, and it is perfectly illustrated in the life and death of Elisha, whose burial sparks a resurrection to complete the 4-part harvest teaching of Jesus. Elisha represents the grape or wine harvest, which is a fall crop, and foreshadows those who are martyred or who otherwise give their lives during great tribulation, as prophesied in Revelation chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. These individuals will, of course, be resurrected at the last trump as part of the 3rd harvest group. A final rapture group is represented by the harvest of olives or oil, which Paul says will experience harpazo, or a catching up, as the Lord descends out of heaven, as stated in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17. Now, we have no way to know the extent to which these harvest groups might overlap. However, I believe an overlap will occur between the wheat raptures of the church and the final harvest group of martyrs before we reach the 7th trumpet. It may well be that certain raptured individuals are seen or witnessed by those who are being martyred. It appears that the forces of Antichrist are coming close to executing the head wound event in which Barack Obama narrowly survives. But let me back up. I skipped a portion that we're still talking about the rapture. This popular Same-Day-Rapture-for-All doctrine puts Christians at risk during the early portions of the harvest because it sows or will sow confusion in the churches once the early raptures begin. And Satan will use this false teaching to convince the Elishas of the church that they were never truly saved. It will be during this time that betrayals within the church will lead many to take the mark and fall away. Now, based on my understanding of current events, the head wound event in which Barack Obama narrowly survives will be a ploy used by the globalists to depose President Trump under the guise of a national emergency in their bid to hold on to power. President Trump may well be accused of personal involvement in such an assault as a pretext for their actions. I can now share with you that the head wound event will occur shortly before rather than after the meteor strikes Europe. The mathematical matrix of Scripture also places the war of Psalm 83 during this time frame. You can imagine the social turmoil in America after Obama's near brush with death as the media accuses Trump and his supporters even without evidence. It will be during this period of mayhem that I expect the meteor to strike Europe, destroying the Vatican and unleashing the plagues of God's judgment. The rise of the Antichrist out of Britain will immediately follow the assault on Obama, after which Obama will be presented to the public using a partial or full-body prosthesis. His inability to appear or speak in public due to his disability will require the use of a robotic facsimile made in his image. This is, in fact, the image of the beast described in Revelation chapter 13. According to Scripture, the facsimile of Obama will be given power to speak, most likely using computer-enabled voice synthesis. Again, see Revelation chapter 13. Also keep in mind that a second, smaller object will strike the interior waterways as a fulfillment of the third trumpet, as stated in Revelation chapter 8. While John does not describe the location of this impact, I believe it may occur in the Great Lakes of the northeastern United States. And the reason I believe that it may strike the northeastern U.S. is because of God's judgment for New York's approval of infanticide. And this may be an act of God's judgment against New York. By the time we reach this second impact, the first fruits rapture will have occurred, and the church will be on notice for part 2 of the great harvest, as the daughter of the king in Psalms 45 is called into the marriage. If you haven't read this passage, please do so and notice that her companions are female, not male virgins, who follow after, not with her. This is another clear teaching from Scripture that the harvest will be divided. As a reminder, this is my 100th video, and the 101st video, for reasons I partially go into in earlier updates, may be my last if indeed we reach critical mass on the clock this spring, or as late as July 12th, where the black ring on the clock comes to an end. I honestly don't know, so remain in prayer as you continue to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Behold, I come quickly. This is Peter John Brandal.